sages which are known as the pairs. Contrary to what we've seen so far in the Mishnah, we see constant transmission from either a group, which are called, let's say, Moses to Joshua, and then a group of the elders, a group of the prophets, and the great assembly. And then we go to individual, Shimon HaTzadik, if you remember. And then we go into, we were discussing Antigonus Isocho, individuals. Now we're starting a new era of sages. We'll try to put it into historical context as we did in the past, because I think it's very important to always bring the Pirkei Avot into the historical context of what was going on exactly at that time. So let's read the Mishnah together, as we did in the past, and we'll talk about the historical context and everything else. I'd like to share an observation that I last night while I was looking at the Mishnah again. I had an idea that came to my head, and I'd like to share that with you. Is Mr. Nathaniel is there with us? Not sure. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, you are? Great. Okay, so let's see it together. Let's see this Mishnah together. Phil, you want to read?
Yeah, hang on a second.
Yeah.
What, they're Yosef ben Yozer?
Yeah.
Yosef ben Yozer, a man of Zeredah, and Yosef ben Yohanan, a man of Jerusalem, received the oral tradition from them. Shimon the righteous and Antigonus. Yosef ben Yozer used to say, "Let thy house be a house of meeting for the sages, and sit in the very dust of their feet, and drink in their words with thirst."
Right. And then if we go to the next one, so here we are taught that about two sages. We have Yosef ben Yoezer, and which was the name was from the city of Tzreda, and then we have Yossi ben Yochanan, was a man of Jerusalem, was from Jerusalem, in other words. So he teaches us probably, and this is maybe an observation that we could make right away, is the sages here are talking for the first time about mitzvot, tenets that are between man to his fellow person. In other words, interpersonal relationship. As contrary to what we've seen in the previous Mishnah, which are dealing more with I'm just going back, dealing more with relationship between God and man, right? So we have the sages of Shimon HaTzadik that told us that about our relationship with God, and incognito Isocho, and then we come into these pair of sages. Yossi ben Yochanan is the second sage. So let me just read what he says. Yossi ben Yochanan, a man of Jerusalem, used to say, "Let thy house be wide open, and let the poor be members of thy household. Engage not in too much conversation with women." This is an interesting one. We'll have to elaborate on that one. They said this with regard to one's wife. How much more does this rule apply with regard to another man's wife? From here, the sages said, as long as a man engages in too much conversation with a woman, he causes evil on himself, he neglects the study of Torah, and in the end, it will inherit Gehenna. Very, very harsh. We have to really see what exactly what this means. Let me go back and give an introduction to this Mishnah. if we're talking about an historical context, we really need to understand what is happening here in this Pirkei Avot. So, following last week's class, after the teaching of Antigonus from Socho, which was the previous sage, that the Mishnah begins with a period in Jewish history known as the period of the pairs. There are five pairs of sages that are mentioned in our chapter. We'll see them. We just saw one of them, Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan. Those are the two pairs. Now, and we'll see four more, beginning in the Mishnah, continuing through the Mishnah 15. The final pair are maybe the pair of sages that were probably the most or more well-known than any of them was Hillel and Shammai. Now, we should know that how important the concept of the sage and learning from the sage in this Mishnah and in the entire chapter. Like, what I'm trying to say is that there's a great emphasis here, and I'd like to have a discussion with all of you about something that I observe, an observation of this Mishnah, and we'll get into a second. There's a lot of emphasis here about learning from the sages. We see it already by the statement of Rabbi Shimon Anshe Knesset Agdola that said that one should learn from the sages, and there's a great emphasis through the whole of Talmud about the greatness of learning from sages and being a student of the sages. Now, so again, historical background, the pairs lived in the period between the Maccabees revolt, which was approximately 167 BCE, until about 2 generations before the destruction of the temple. So we have about 300 years of pairs, of these sages that were called the pairs, zugot in Hebrew. This was a time where many Jews became greatly influenced by Hellenistic culture. It was also the formative period of many of the sects, as we know that in that time, including the Sadducees, and probably the Essenes, as well as the Dead Sea sect, who were probably Essenes. It was probably also the formative period of the Pharisees, which are called the Prushim, which were the predecessors of the rabbi of the Mishnah and Talmud. Now, against this historical background, it's easy to understand why these sages were so concerned with the authority and influence that they would have on the general public. Now, it's okay. So that was the historical background, really, of what's going on in this Mishnah, at least the backdrop of the history. Now, I want to take you to a Talmudic piece which breaks down all these sages. If I could just share that with you right here. 1 second, sorry.
Rabbi, how come they're always pairs?
Oh, exactly. That's exactly where I was getting to. You see this text now?
Mm-hmm.
Yossi ben Yoezer says on the festival. Can everybody see that text?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is really answering your question. So this period is called the pairs because they're always paired up as being the Nasi, I would say the president, and then the head of the heads of court. So there was a time in Jewish history, or in Jewish, specifically in this Talmudic time, where there's somebody that represents as kind of like the CEO, if you want, oral transmission, an oral tradition. And then there's the actual head of the court, which would be the one that would teach the students and would pass on the oral tradition in the yeshivot, in the different batei midrashot. We have to also realize that the center of Jewish study, of the Jewish intellectuals, wasn't the Bet HaMidrash. So if one wanted to kind of stimulate himself intellectually, he would go to the Bet HaMidrash, where there were great sages, big debates, debates about everything, debates about a theological question, existential question, obviously laws. So here, the Mishnah here tells us that this is a piece of Gemara that brings down the 5 pairs. And I would like to point out something. The Talmud is probably one of the most abstract texts that the Jewish people have. Did any one of you ever seen a page of a Talmud, how it looks?
Yeah.
You've seen the Talmud. I mean, there's no dots, there's no no titles.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
There's no dots, there's no titles, no subtitles. You don't know where it begins. There's no commas, no period. It's so abstract. And I think that it was done willingly. There's a purpose behind it. Even the historical context is never here. If we go back to the oral transmission from Moshe Rabbeinu, from Moses, until these sages that are called the pairs here, Yossi ben Yoezer and Rabbi Yochanan, we're talking about over 1,000 years of difference. And here, they're all stated in one Mishnah. There's no historical, nobody's telling us who they are. Where did they, I mean, they're telling us from which city they came from. Thank you very much, Tzerida. There's no historical background. There's no context. You have to really delve in and look and read between the lines to really understand what's going on here, to really get a real feel of this oral tradition. Is completely opaque. You have to look between the lines and the messages that are hidden within the actual text itself. Now, and I think that this is, again, my personal observation. Why is it that there's no time period stated in the Mishnah? Why is it that the places or any of these things are not clearly stated on any of the Mishnayot? I mean, not specifically only about this Mishnah, but any other Mishnah, any other Talmudic passage. So, I'll tell you my take on it. The Torah, and when I mean the Torah, I'm including the Talmud here. The Torah itself is not an historical book. Even the stories that we hear, the historical events that happened at the time of biblical time, it doesn't make the Torah an historical book. Yes, there are historical events in the Bible, in the Torah itself, but it's by no means or definition a history book. Now, the absence of the above mentioned factors of location, time, titles, subtitles, like a book, if you would give such a book to anyone, he'll be like, where do we start and where do we end? And I think the absence of these factors is a clear indication of this, that it's not an historical book. We're not going just simply through history. There's a lot more in the background than there is on the surface. Now, another possible explanation to this is of the absence of the aforementioned is really of the expression of the eternity of the Torah and its messages and its laws that were given by the sages. Because the moment where you already give a time, and there's a time period, there's a location, there's a title, there's dates, you're limiting it to that specific time. So the fact that the sages did not want to include either titles or subtitles, like any other historical book, or time periods or locations of what they have, is really their expression of telling us this is not a history book. The laws that are here and that are written down, the messages that are in the Torah are eternal. They're not for a specific time. They're not for a specific place. As we know, I'll give you an example. And friends, we can turn this, I would love to turn this into a nice debate, or if you have any.
So Rabbi, does that mean that it's written that way, and you've got a pair of sages, and you're encouraged to learn with sages? Is that really saying a message that there's an interpretation of this interpretation?
Phil, your mic is not on properly. You're being cut.
You're
it's
just
not straight.
I got part of it. You're a little bit choppy, Phil.
Yeah, it is choppy.
Is this bad? I'm not doing anything different. Is this bad?
Rabbi, would you mind removing the sheet of paper, the page, please, Rabbi?
You guys are happy if I move it? It's fine. You don't need to see the text. With pleasure. Okay. Yeah.
It's better this so we can see the people.
Oh, can you hear me or no?
Yeah.
We hear
you can. You will.
Well, now, okay, nothing happened. So my question is the reason for the sages, the reason for encouraging learning with sages, the reason for the Talmud being written as whatever, no punctuation or whatnot, is the reason for all of this. The message is being sent as it requires interpretation. In every generation, it requires interpretation. Is that, do you agree to that?
Definitely. That means that it's not. It's that every generation could very well need an interpretation that is for that stage. But at the same time, telling when you look at a history book, and you're reading the history about a certain time in history, so you said to yourself, well, look, that's that was in those days, and with those times, that was applicable back then, and people lived in a certain environment, and this is how it is then, and that's it. It's part of history. By removing all these elements which define what a history book is, by definition, the sages are giving us a hint that, look, the laws that are here are not just an historical event. There's not something that happened thousands of years ago and it was somewhere in Iraq, because most of the Talmud, at least the Babylonian Talmud, was in Babylon at that time, and the center of Torah was in Babylon. And although there was a big center of Torah in Jerusalem as well, but the Babylonian Talmud proceeded and continued after Jerusalem Talmud was already not part of the center of Talmud. And yes, so you can't say, well, look, the sages are telling us this is not part of history. This is present now. It's not just an historical event or laws that were back then. Yes, the fundamental things, society and culture changes, yes, but the messages of the Torah are eternal. Yes, of course. And Torah has to, in many ways, reinvent itself through generations. Of course, when we look about Judaism in the time of in Babylon, was very different than what Judaism looks today, and that's fine. But the eternity of the laws, or the spirit of the law, are present, ever present in the Talmud. And I think that here we find the emphasis of of the sages, already in the teaching of, let me just look back in the teaching of Yossi ben Yoezer, just to reiterate what he said. Let your house be a house of meeting for the sages, and sit in the very dust of their feet, and drink in the words of their thirst. So here again, the emphasis on Talmudic and rabbinical authority, which they find, according to the sages, establishing rabbinical authority was of high importance in Talmudic, for the Talmudic sages. They believed that, according to them, it ensured Jewish continuation and transmission of the Torah and the wisdom of oral tradition. I would like to point out a very interesting story. And two stories. First one is these sages were mentioned as pairs, as we mentioned. There was the president and then the head of the court. In Hebrew, the Nasi, and then the Av Bedin. Those are the periods of the pairs. Two sages. Shammai, Hillel and Shammai, Shammai and Naftalion, etc. Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan. There's another teaching of a Mishnah where they have a whole discussion about whether you could do a certain thing on Yom Tov. There's many restrictions about what we are allowed to do on Shabbat and what we are allowed to do on Yom Tov. And the truth is that those restrictions for us many times could be very annoying, at least to say. And we see the same debate for 5 generations of sages, one after the same debate for hundreds of years. But they found that this debate was probably as one of the core of discussion of Jewish oral tradition. I'm not going to get into the actual discussion itself of what they were going back and forth, but there was a restriction on Yom Tov that on the Chag itself, that some of them said you're not allowed to do it, and the other one said yes, you're allowed to do it, and the debate goes on for hundreds of years. There was a debate about Shabbat and Yom Tov and the definition of what you are allowed to do on Shabbat and Yom Tov through the whole Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli. There's a great anecdote of a debate between Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Eliezer was known to be, they were both Talmudists, and Rabbi Eliezer was known to be a very, they were both very distinguished and prominent teachers and students, great sages. Rabbi Eliezer was known to be very sharp, and he was very witty also, very wealthy, contrary to Rabbi Yeshua. Rabbi Yeshua he's very witty as well, but was a simple Jew, worked a simple job, not very wealthy, not a prominent family. And we see them debating about something that was going on and on. At one point, Rabbi Eliezer says, when he sees that Rabbi Yeshua does not accept his opinion, he says, okay, look, if I'm right, this tree is going to fold over in two. And sure enough, the Talmud says the tree falls over. So Rabbi Yeshua tells him, you can't bring a proof from trees. Nothing, we don't believe you. We're not accepting your opinion. He says, you know what? If I'm right, let this stream of water turn the other way and go backwards. And sure enough, it happens. And again, Rabbi Yeshua tells him, don't bring me proofs from water. We're not trusting in miracles. And back and forth, these miracles are happening in this Bet Midrash, and back and forth, without getting into all the details. There's a lot more to say. Suddenly, Rabbi Eliezer tells him, you know what? If I'm right, let a voice from heaven come down and say that Rabbi Eliezer is right. And sure enough, again, a voice comes from heaven and says, what are you guys? You guys can't compare to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is the greatest sage of all time. You guys just sit back and listen. You think at this point, Rabbi Yeshua would say, oh, a voice from heaven? Fine. How can you argue with a voice from heaven? He doesn't. Rabbi Yeshua gets up on his feet and he says, the Torah is not in heavens. The Torah is given here to men. We do not determine laws based on what's going up in the heavens, what's going up in the skies, somewhere in a metaphysical place. The Torah was given here to human beings. Yes, here, and it's here we determine. And what do we determine? The Torah tells us we have to follow a majority. When there's a debate and people are arguing and people are saying we must follow the majority. And since the majority of us do not agree with you, Rabbi Eliezer, and we don't even agree with the voice that comes from heaven, we have the authority to determine what the halacha is. So, why did I want to bring out from this? And I get this question all the time. I tell you, Rabbi, fine. So if the Torah is here, down here, it's given to human beings. So we can, human beings could determine how the halacha works, right? We could change it. Can we tamper with what the halacha is giving us? Can we change certain things in order to adjust to our lives and to make it a little bit more accessible? Yes, we can. But that Torah was given to the sages. That means that if we want to determine how we view Torah today and how do we view its laws and how they're applicable, it's up to the sages to determine. Why? Because behind the whole system of law, behind the whole system of thinking and the process of thinking that's in the Talmud, that we know that for us it's the oral tradition, there's a whole system behind it. You have to understand, in order to determine what the halacha is, in order to determine how do we decide what is acceptable lawfully, it's up to the sages. It's like coming to the executive meeting without knowing the bylaws. Right? I mean,
I'm sure that never happens.
Right? In order to determine what is the appropriate way to conduct, there's a whole system behind it. There's a sages. We can't decide on our own, saying, "Well, yeah, we feel that this is the right." I feel, and this could be argued, and I encourage you to disagree with me. I think, as not only as a rabbi but as a person, that the Torah is way ahead of its time. I had a young man telling me, Rabbi, we have to protect the environment, and you should encourage. He told me to do something about it in the synagogue. We should encourage people to take care of the environment. I said, yeah, for sure. I told him, I think Judaism is the most ecological religion in the world. He tells me, really? How do you come about that? I said, well, it's very simple. There's a whole big campaign now, so people use their car once a day a year. I said, what do you mean? I don't take my car 60 days a year. I have 52 Shabbat and I have 6 days of holidays, which I can't take my car. You can't compete with me. You have to go 60 years before you can get to what I do in a year. It's not ecological. Look at the laws that we just saw in this past few Shabbat, Beher and Buchukotai, speaking about giving rest to the land. Work the land 6 years. There's a 7th year you have the land needs to rest. It's something that ecologically is needed. It's part of nature. The land needs to rest. Give it its rest. Everybody needs to rest. Your animals, even at the time of Shabbat, when people would use animals, your animals cannot work on Shabbat. They need to rest as well. So, and then there's the whole idea of lending money and how to lend money, and the ownership of land, and the idea of amassing is owning land just to amass money and treasures. No. The Torah has a whole system of how our lives should be conducted, even up to our modern times. Today, people don't look. When I was growing up, I'm not that old, but when I was growing up, I remember probably 8 of the 10 of my friends all wanted to be big entrepreneurs, big houses. Today, people change. Our model of what we want to be today is, we want to have more time to spend with our family. We want to care about the nature. It's not about industrial things. Things change, and that the Torah was always present and eternal. And that is constantly here in our time, that it's a very pertinent message to us even today. And that's why I think that the Talmud sages needed to tell us that all these ideas that we find in the Torah is very well founded in the Talmud. For many generations, even Christians, Muslims, viewed the Talmud as the secret of the Jewish people. I mean, the Talmud was probably burnt publicly more than any other books in the world. I mean, the famous public burning of the Talmud in the 13th century at the time in Paris, publicly burned. That the church always viewed the Talmud as the wisdom of the Jewish people. And I think that the sages, again, going back to our initial discussion, our sages wanted to hide many messages behind and inside the Talmud that must really delve in order to find the hidden messages that are in the Talmud, and not just simply see it as a text that was part of Jewish history, but a very pertinent and eternal text that can be used until now in our days. Okay, let me just reread the Mishnah here. So, can I give you an example? Maybe you'll like it, or maybe you don't like it. I'll give you an example of a hidden message, maybe not a message, but a hidden fact that's behind in our Mishnah. When I looked at last night, I was looking at this at the order of the Mishnah. So the first Mishnah is a very general idea, right? Moses received the Torah and he gave it to the sages and so on. Now, when you look at the first Mishnah, what does it tell you? It speaks about first of all the importance of transmitting the Torah, and it tells us, you should have a lot of students. Anshe Knesset tells us you should have many students. Why? Because it's important for the transmission of the Torah. Yes, beautiful. When we get to the next one, Shimon HaTzadik, what does he tell us? Shimon HaTzadik tells us the purpose of creation. Right? We spoke about that. Torah, Avodah, and Gmilut Chasadim. That's the purpose of creation. When we come to Antigonos, he tells us the purpose of our service, of a divine service. Beautiful. We're still not talking about any mitzvot, any precept that are between man and man, interpersonal relationship. We're talking about our relationship with God. I encourage you to look back in the text and you'll tell me if you agree with me or not. We are not at this point talking about any interpersonal relationship or any mitzvot that are speaking to man to man. When we get to our Mishnah today, Yossi ben Yoezer, we're talking about already interpersonal relationship. Greet the poor people into your house. Bring them feed them, give them, do gmilut chasadim, do all of these things. And at this point, we're talking about interpersonal relationship. Okay, so if we accept this analogy, let's look at the 10 Commandments. In the 10 Commandments, there are the 2 tablets, right? The first tablets, what do we have, friends? The mitzvot ben adam lamakom, right? The mitzvot that are between man and God. Well, there's the 5th one that there's always a discussion whether it's between honoring your parents. Is honoring your parents between you and God or between man and man and the personal relationship? Okay, but let's leave that alone for a second. The second tablets are interpersonal relationship between man and man. First tablets, man and God. Second one, between human beings. Don't kill, don't steal, don't, etc. Those two tablets, the second pair of tablets or the second column of the tablets, parallel here to what Rabbi Yochanan ben Yoez said. How many pairs were there? 5. It's a hint that the 5 sages, the 5 pairs, are parallel to the 5 mitzvot that are between man and man, interpersonal relationship. And it starts here in the Mishnah. In other words, the Mishnah is telling us that it's a direct continuation. The Talmud is a direct continuation of the Torah, which is as known as the Bible, right? There's no differentiation between the Talmud and the Chumash. They're equally as important in our Jewish tradition. And here it's hinted inside the Mishnah itself, telling us after we spoke about creation, after we spoke about our relationship with God, now we are talking about our relationship with man and interpersonal relationship. So here, Albert, did you want to ask something?
Well, I didn't want to interrupt, but since you're asking,
yes, please.
The notion of the two tablets,
yeah,
5 and 5, is what we know now. But in actual fact, from what we're told in Kabbalah, that it was not that when the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, it wasn't 2 tablets. It was a cube, a translucent cube. So it could not have been 5 and 5. I don't know how the order was. I don't know how they were arranged. But this notion of 5 and 5 is a present idea that's maybe 2,000 years ago. Am I right in assuming that?
So I mean, there's not really a country. I know exactly what you're referring to, and you're completely right. Yes, that's true. Kabbalah does speak about such an idea, but it's not really a contradiction to the fact that it could be that it was one cube, but the way it was written, the whole discussion in the Talmud or even in the Zohar is the way it was written. Was it in 2 columns? So it could have been on one cube, but it was written in 2 separate columns. And there is an opinion that says, no, well, it was written in 1 column and it was not written in 2 columns. But how do we get to this whole idea whether they were written in 2 columns or not? Because it says clearly that when God asked Moses to write the tablets, he says it in plural, al-luchot, right? Luchot meaning tablets. And I think this is where the whole discussion is around, whether it was written in 2 columns, whether it's 2 different, right? It was 2 different. Contrary to also known, an accepted opinion is that they were round, like you've seen the movie, right? 10 Commandments. we all see this movie when Moses come down with the tablets and they're round at the top, they're beautiful, but they were not round. And that's also an historical mistake, because the tablets were in the covenant, the Aaron, and it was completely sealed, and so it had to be completely cubical, like you mentioned. We never know. Nevertheless, we know that those tablets, they were commandments between God, and there were commandments between, whether they were split up in two separate ones, we know for sure that they were, there was a category of
man versus God, and man towards God, and man towards man.
That's right. That's right.
Right. Okay.
So here, let's see what he says. Yossi ben Yoezer encourages. In fact, Yossi ben Yoezer is encouraging us. I'm looking at the Mishnah again. What is he doing, Yossi ben Yoezer? Yossi ben Yoezer is encouraging us to sorry, I lost the spot here. Yeah. Yossi ben Yoezer has encouraged Jews to make their own homes into a place of gathering for sages. And if we look here, he says clearly, let thy house be a meeting for sages. One should sit at their dust of their feet, which reflects the custom of the day where the sage would sit. And in those days, the sage would sit on a chair, and the disciples would sit kind of like on a carpet. At this time, we also see that a period in history fixed where the study halls, especially in Babylonia, was in that custom. Learning the oral Torah from disciples again ensured really the transmission of the Torah through generation, and ensuring that it would probably be passed on to generation. Yes. Yes. Okay. There's a few more things I wanted to talk about in the second part, but I think it's going to go a little bit too long, so we'll keep it for next week's class. It's a little bit. We'll keep it. Is there any other points that you wanted to discuss about this specific thing?
No, I'm looking at the PRK, but they just kind of, because it's not on the screen, just lost it where you are.
Yes. I can pull it back on the screen if you like. Let me just take it to the Mishnah.
Oh, there. Number 4.
Yeah, Yossi ben Yoezer.
Yeah.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes, please.
When it says here, let thy house be a house of meeting for the sages, etc., are we led to believe that this means let learning come into every household, worship every learning, learn from all the teachings?
Yes.
In other words, open your house to the learning process.
That's right. Open your house to the learning. The voice of learning should be in your house, of debates, of conversations, of receiving this great wisdom. Exactly. That's exactly it.
So that's why we're doing it on Zoom, so it'll be in our homes.
Definitely, it's part of that.
There's a reason for everything, they say, right?
That's right. That's right. There's a reason for everything. And yes, Phil? I'm sorry.
Oh, David's on mute. You're on mute, David.
Oh. David is on mute?
No.
So
Yeah.
Rabbi Charles, David's brother. So
Yeah.
you're talking about ecology and the planet, and that even the planet needs rest, our animals need rest, and you gave that mention. We know that farmers used to rotate their fields, leave certain fields fallow. But I remember, and maybe I want you to remind me, that there was a time where you were not allowed to work for a whole year when you were living in Israel. The whole year went by and no one was allowed to work, or was it just the Kohanim? I'm not sure how that
No,
was.
you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. It's until today. Until today, there's a time. Those in Israel that keep the laws, the Torah laws, they don't work the land for a whole year. It's called Shevi'it, or in Hebrew, in Israel, they call it Shemitah, meaning Shvi'it, meaning the 7th year. And it's a cycle. And then there's the Jubilee here, right? So every 7th year, they don't work the land. And then again, at the 49th year, they don't work the land again. So it's a cycle of 7 years. And then again, a cycle after 7 years again. On the 50th year, they don't work the land. Exactly. Until today, it's practiced by everyone, not only Levites or Kohanim.
So I have another meeting at 1, but I just wanted to make another
Yes, please.
few comments, which are, it was in this time with the virus, and there's so much uncertainty. What's going to happen? Are we going to land on our feet? How long is it going to take? And so on and so forth. But that is really the basic concept in Judaism, that God's going to take care of us. We just have to follow the Torah. We have to be faithful. We have to do our best. And that's why there's many references to that it's not really in our hands. If our enemies are going to attack us or whatever, if you do follow the laws of the Torah, and you allow things to happen because you really believe that God will take care of us. So that was it.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing with that. I think that joins a little bit what we were talking about. That, in fact, a time where we're not able to really relate to the messages in the Torah sometimes, because when you look at the messages, like, wow, these things seems like way part of history and everything, but sometimes it's just I think it takes time for man, and I think the whole humanity, to sometimes really see the messages that are hidden inside the Torah and how pertinent they are. It's true that we can't always see it, but the fact that we don't see it, it doesn't mean that it's not there. Our understanding sometimes or our perception of things are not always are quite understanding according to the Torah. The whole idea of resting on Shabbat. So I get that all the time. Is there anybody today in the world, okay, that could tell you, well, without getting into the whole restriction of Shabbat and what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to, the whole thing, the whole idea of resting, it's a universal idea. Can anybody agree with that today? I met a whole group of parents in Tel Aviv at the time in Israel, and they've decided that in the school they have one day where they don't let their kids use their cell phones, and they decided to be a Wednesday. And I was like, Judaism has been talking about this Judaism is talking about it for thousands of years, not to use one. It's a perfect, you have to choose a Wednesday, so choose a Shabbat. So we see how beneficial these things. I can't even imagine. My kids are so crazy about gadgets now, and the phones and the iPads, and they're young, I couldn't imagine doing kiddush and my kids sitting on the table. Nobody would listen to me. They would be on their Facebook, on their phone. It wouldn't look like a kiddush, So I think that a lot of the messages for us and for humanity takes a little bit of time to really realize how pertinent the Torah is, and how its ideas and its philosophies are very eternal, very pertinent to our days. you know, the whole idea of what it means to rest. You know, so I get these questions all the time. So I'm sharing with you these questions. I get these questions all the time. Rabbi, come on, there was no phones at the time. You think Moses didn't have a cell phone? Come on. How can you bring this up? It's not written in the Torah. It doesn't even speak about cell phones. What? So again, I think again, it's a valid question for sure, because it's true. There's no such things of electricity at the time of Moses or time of Solomon or King David and everything. They didn't have any airplanes. They didn't have any cars and everything. But they still valued, maybe at those times they didn't have what we have, the technologies that we have today, but they still knew how to value what it means to rest, what it means to disconnect. Okay, so their disconnection was very different in their times. But today being disconnected is something different. So that whole idea of disconnecting still exists. It's very pertinent. What you disconnect from changed. Yes, we agree. We disconnect from cards, from phones, from whatever it is. But that disconnection at the time of Moses and the disconnection of today is exactly the same thing. What we disconnect from changed, fine. But that disconnection of the idea of resting and really getting back to your source, because what is Shabbat? The word of Shabbat means to return. Shabbat milashevet, to return. Where are you returning? You're returning to yourself. You're not going anywhere. You're returning to who you are, back to yourself. And that every person needs to do.